I'm Margaret Johnson, and I'm serving as the Interim Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, and I'm currently overseeing the Program for Instructional Effectiveness, which is hosting today's event. Our session today will begin with a presentation, and then we will have some time for questions and discussion later in the session. I would like to begin by introducing our speaker for today. Shin Kue Ryu is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. He received his PhD from George Mason University, Master of Science from University of London, and an MA and BA from Washington University in St. Louis. He has been at ISU for 5 years and is actively involved in serving the local community, and he was recognized as one of the outstanding teachers for the last academic year, 2020 to 2021. Today, Kue will be giving a presentation titled, Bringing the Outside World to Less Traveled Students, Tips and Pointers.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Margaret. I am honored to speak and share some of my own approaches to enhancing the educational experience of my students at Idaho State University. My talk is titled Bridging the Outside World to Less Traveled Students, Tips and Pointers. For me, this is an important topic as it lies at the core of my teaching philosophy, which is to make my students internationally competitive. Students today must navigate a different world than their predecessors, and this is because we are currently operating in a global knowledge economy, whereby the emphasis is on global, that is further accentuated with the realization and establishment of global value chains. There is no truly isolated economies, and Pocatello, Idaho is no different. Not only do we see the intertwined economic activities in consumption as evident in the aisles of Walmart and Fred Meyer's, but we see local economic production activities tied to the outside world, represented with the semiconductor factory and the freight chain movements. For improved contextualization, I provide the following slides. In 2019, US has exported $1.5 trillion worth of goods to the world. And the composition is varied and represents a diverse US landscape, industrial landscape. On the flip side, US has imported approximately $2.4 trillion worth of goods in 2019. Equivalently, it represents a diverse portfolio of goods. It is important to note that the trade represented here are not restricted to final manufactured goods, but also include intermediary goods with supply chains. This is most evident in the large trade volume with Canada and Mexico as part of the USMCA trade bloc. These all point to the reality that we are living in an era of the international contextualization. Hence, it is imperative to prepare our students accordingly. Now, here's the challenge. Majority of our students come from Idaho. Unfortunately, this is the only source that I could find with regards to our students' geographical origins. There is no discussion or mentioning of such information in our accreditation and assessment reports. Although College Factual is not necessarily the most reliable source, but so far, based on my teaching experience here, this is to a large degree fairly accurate. Majority of our students are from Idaho, and more specifically from Southeast Idaho. The question you may ask is, why is this a challenge? ISU is upholding the regional institutional mandate by drawing students from adjacent counties, so it seems pretty satisfactory. The challenge is that Idaho's economy is relatively small compared to the rest of the US. As you can see from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Idaho's contribution to the overall US gross domestic product, which is an indicator of economic production, is relatively on the smaller side. Now, why does that matter, and how does this matter to the students? It matters in terms of exposure and internalized outlook of our students. As interpretive beings, context and its associated experience forms our outlook. This is no different for our students. If you look at the region in which we draw our students, they mainly come from agricultural sectors. Yes, there are students with backgrounds in trades, especially those from regional trade centers such as Pocatello and Idaho Falls, but it is still relatively bounded. If Idaho was a country, in terms of economic production, it's 31st in the world. This also does not factor into account that bulk of Idaho's industrial and commercial production and contribution to the overall Idaho state economy is anchored and derived from the Treasure Valley of Boise and its surroundings. The inadvertent consequence of the context is that everything is seen from an Idaho reference point. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, my teaching philosophy is to make students internationally competitive, the emphasis being on international. The concern I have is that it may perpetuate bounded rationality of suboptimal outcomes and outlooks. That is, it may maintain a status quo of unrealized potential within our students, as the interactive and limited observation reference point reinforces a false sense of competitiveness. This is particularly problematic as the world is constantly evolving and changing as we speak. The world is changing and is slated to change. We invited a guest speaker who was a senior advisor to the vice president of the World Bank, and she noted the following: the world economy is expected to grow 2 or 3 times by 2050. Business as usual will imply need for 40% more food, 55% more water. Infrastructure will grow twofold, 80% increase in electricity production is warranted, and 1 billion more cars will be placed on the road. The world population will hit 9.6 billion in 2050, which is a significant increase from an already unprecedented figure of 7.9 billion already roaming the world in 2021. More relevant for Idaho due to its reliance on agriculture is potential degradation in agricultural land. Also, urbanization will continue, with 72% of the world's population expected to live in urban areas by 2050. Technology is changing how we live, both in terms of our consumption as evidenced in our reliance of smartphones and provided functions, but also in terms of job availability, as it expected that automation will replace and potentially permanently erase jobs in certain sectors. Of note is the evolving automatic driving technology and its impact on the trucking industry within the US. In a nutshell, the world is changing, which means any effort to enhance competitiveness need to be cognizant of such changes and work in tandem to evolving global landscape. One way to highlight such diversity is through visuals to my students. Idaho, as part of the US, is different from developing countries, as evident by this picture, which I took from my fieldwork in Indonesia. Clearly, building codes, waste management, water quality management differs from countries that still need work on this front. However, these countries are not staying static, or traditional peripheral countries are not staying static. Countries are evolving. For example, countries engaged in rapid city modernization. This is relevant as Idaho does not have iconic structures where other countries' settings are investing in it. And this is an example of John Nouvel's National Museum in Doha that's just been recently opened. Countries with access to wealth and resources are evolving rapidly, as evident in this Middle Eastern country. To stay competitive, Europe is engaged in modernizing their environments, as evident in the facelift and modernization of an once old district. Emerging economies are making bold investments to propel themselves into the fore of the global economy, and legacy economic powers are reimagining and renovating themselves to stay relevant in the global economy. So a large part of this change is spurred and propelled by technological advancements, as all faculty has experienced while at ISU. Enhanced remote connection technology is available and is here to stay. In addition, visual media enhancements are available with high definition, both in physical portable devices, such as DVDs, Blu-rays, and cloud accessibility, as in the case of online viewing and storage. Coming from an era of videotapes and blockbuster shops, times have definitely changed. Harnessing the available technology, I integrated guest lecturers into my curriculum. In the past 4 years at ISU, I invited the following people to my lectures. They include the World Bank Senior Advisor to the Senior Vice President Office for the 2030 Development Agenda, United Nations Relations and Partnerships, Senior Director of Sustainable Development at Asian Development Bank and Visiting Fellow at Stanford University, Senior Economist and author of the World Bank's Cambodia Systematic Country Diagnostics Report, Senior Economist at the International Monetary Fund's Fiscal Affairs Department, immediate past chair of South Korea's Presidential Committee on Autonomy and Decentralization, senior public-private partnership specialist at the World Bank, was also the former head of Portugal's PPP unit, senior infrastructure specialist at the World Bank, who is responsible for the $350 million water sector loan to the government of Tanzania, and the senior operations officer of the Korean Green Growth Trust Fund within the Sustainable Development Practice at the World Bank, and also a lecturer from Yale Architecture School, who was also the past director of media studies at Architectural Association, who is currently a faculty member at Lehigh University. And lastly, the managing principal at a Utah-based property developer who is engaged in the Northgate PPP projects here in Idaho, in Pocatello. Now, inviting speakers is not an end goal in itself, but rather they serve as a means to enhance students' education. Thus, preparations are required. These include sharing the syllabus with the guest speaker and having an early discussion. This is because it is important to make sure the guest lecturers are fully integrated with the overall objective of the course. Furthermore, it is important to prepare the students for the guest speakers and their talks. If there are publications involved, it is important to assign the readings and relevant readings to the students. The importance of an early meeting with the speakers is vital. It is important to study their materials to build linkages with other course materials and coverage. If it is determined that the existing curriculum would not adequately prepare the students for them to actively engage in the presented materials, curriculum adjustments need to be done. Also, since the guest speakers are not necessarily located in Idaho or the US, the logistics of time differential or making sure the time difference is recognized is vital. This may change as well if the guests are traveling. Also, be aware of environmental barriers. We later found out that the day of the presentation that the International Monetary Fund has a firewall that prevents any video transmission from their building. Created a logistical headache at the last moment and, of course, a bit of panic. It is also important to note that adjustments need to be made in order for the presented material to be relevant. This is improved via two approaches. First, I focus on the aptitude preparation. If technical terms and tools will be used, I found it important to inform the students ahead of time. Also, I would prep and prepare students to ask insightful questions. The subject matter of most guest lecturers are predefined if we follow the process of actually talking to the guest speakers early and integrating into the curriculum. So nudging thought on the matter is possible ahead of time. It's basically forcing students to think about certain matters and the relevance of it, and throwing readings before it. Also, I realized that students retain material better if it is transferable. Thus, adjustment and preparation by the host, basically me in this case, is necessary to make the link between the shared materials and its relevance to the local context. Because if it's, if the guest lecturer is talking about something that is totally irrelevant to the local context, what's the point? Now, for me, this is all, the guest speakers and these preparations are all means to an end. My two subset end goals are making sure students properly absorb the materials and in turn builds their confidence on the subject matter. The two are interconnected. Without proper absorption, there is no confidence, and that's kind of what I realized. So absorption, what that is, this is tricky and entails more effort than presumed. This is because there is an inherent gap between the guest speakers who are professionals at the top of their game and the students who are still learning the material. Now, secondly, I think one thing that we also need to pay attention to is that it's also the burden is on myself to actually understand where the students stand in terms of their aptitude, right? So having a good understanding of what the students are comfortable with and what additional aspects they need improvement upon is vital. And this is basically the way to do this is to actually engage in some similar questions or relevant questions, and then also hearing their viewpoints and also hearing their ability, aptitude on certain subject matter that is relevant to the presentation. Now, another thing in terms of kind of further nudge this thinking is to make the linkages relevant to the local context. And here's an example. So we had a presentation from the first director of the Global Center on Adaptations, and she shared this interesting discussion, which is crises are more frequent, protracted, and costly. Right. So this is the global reported natural disasters by type from 1970 to 2019. And as you can see, natural disasters has clearly increased over time, and also its magnitude as well, too. So extreme weather hit every continent in 2019. So these include wildfires in California, Cyclone Idai in Southern Africa, Typhoon Hagibis in Japan, Cyclone Fani in Bangladesh and India. And furthermore, there's March and April floods in Iran in 2019, and Typhoon Lakima in China, Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, and bushfires in Australia. Now, the way to kind of say, oh, yeah, the world is burning, the world is experiencing natural disasters. So what is this, how does this tie with the local context? Well, and the way to do this is to do a little bit of study and to figure out, hey, look, this is Idaho, and Pocatello, Idaho is not immune to it. And here's an example. So the flames, this is a picture of Pocatello wildfire that scorched 1,450 acres. Right. So, and people around in Pocatello are recognize that the wildfires do exist and are frequent. Right. And so, and this is to kind of say that, things happening in the world is not necessarily happening in isolation with what's happening in Pocatello. Now, kind of recognition of the issue is one thing, but also kind of nudging or thinking about possible solutions to this is also another element of that instruction. And so here's an example of what we did, and this is particularly retains to really rethink about this local area, right? And so this is a 3D visualization of Pocatello. This is actually created with help from Keith Weber at the GIS ISU GIS Center. So we were able to kind of map out Pocatello. And this is using a program called ArcGIS Urban. Now, one thing, this technology is also evolving. So this is a visualization of the company that actually builds this is called Esri. Esri just recently acquired, I think, for $2 billion N-frames, which is, and this is a 3D visualization of the city with more detailed visual layers. And this is possible because while we're in terms of thinking about solutions, and this is even kind of the latest and the pioneering works, is that certain things have evolved over time. Which is faster computer processing ability in terms of advancements in graphical processing units, better image capturing technology via diverse means and stakeholders, such as LiDAR data via planes and drones, and also Mapillary, which is a software that, or a company that also provides maintenance of horizontal data. And this, the complementary developments in the software industry aims to harness technological developments that are more user-friendly. So another thing that I kind of also did was, in addition to kind of highlighting these international issues, basically look at what is international transferable technologies. And so, so we started adopting, and this is a specific case, is ArcGIS Urban. And for those who are not familiar with ArcGIS Urban, it's a geographical information system that really has been built in the last 2 years. And so in this process, what I did was, of course, because it's so new, but it's kind of the latest and the shiniest, I had to create a manual for it. So, so I worked with a software company and created a manual to actually have students to actually play and engage in various scenario developments. This were some of the efforts. In addition to, it's not only about guest speakers and it's not only about bringing internationalization, but also looking for, okay, how do I build internationally transferable competitive technologies or competitive capacities within my students? And this was an example of that. So this is something I did in terms of more specifically, this was I built a manual I had to work with constantly. And also there's kind of a lot of other background work. So there is actually an association. The software company had hosted a series of meetings between other university professors across the US and internationally to convene every month to talk about how they can integrate these course materials into, or the program into their curriculum, and also sharing what is best approaches and what were troubleshooting areas. And so now, because it's so new, what's also really relevant was also for us to provide input into this also technology and solution as well too. And so this is where we are in terms of this adoption. Now you can kind of see this technology has evolving. So this is a campus, as you can see, this is campus information. Now we can see that it's not only, this program not only provides 3D visualization in the left, but it also can provide actual imagery onto the right. So since the program will use GPU functionality, I'm not going to push it, but basically you can kind of, I went around, collected video footages of the entire camp to a certain segment of the campus. And basically in this program, you can click and you can actually see the horizontal view. Now, this is also relevant in terms of finding solutions, especially because vertical data does not capture horizontal data, such as stop signs and other stuff. So the end goal is building confidence, and this is approached in two ways. I also, in addition to kind of what the world is, bring the world to them, and to, in two ways, bring the people who are working on international issues and things outside of Idaho. And then also teach them the latest and the most relevant, and also as they're able to, as they study and they actually utilize it and engage in discussions, I also let the test of time repeatedly validate that this is indeed the case. Now, in terms of in terms of other kind of maybe tips and pointers, I always found some things I haven't covered, but sending thank you notes, taking after receiving consent from the students to take a picture, class picture, and send a thank you note where all the students would sign and send to the guest speakers. And also have students actually, so in terms of this ArcGIS program, what we did was that students actually did renovation projects or kind of scenario developing projects around the ISU. And basically we presented to Esri. We also talked about the problems with their program and things that we want to be improved. So not only were students engaged in utilizing the latest, but they're also providing input to the latest. Now, in terms of, the big question is, was this effective? Was this teaching method effective? And to a large degree, I would like to say yes. I know Mark and I are writing a paper thinking about whether it has improved. I mean, there are signs. I know we do an exit survey for our MPH students, and our MPH students have improved in satisfaction over the years in terms of whether they were satisfied with their education. So there are there has been individual emails saying students do utilize this and are finding this helpful in their work settings as well too. So I know I'm supposed to present for 40 minutes. Maybe I'm happy to kind of open discussions on this.
Thank you so much, Q. That's great. I don't think anyone's probably unhappy that the presentations are shorter. I'd like to start us off You talked at one point about your preparation for uh, getting students ready for your guest speakers. And you said that one of the things you do is help prep them to ask significant questions. And I have brought guest speakers of various sorts to classes before, and I've often found it challenging to get them to write those questions. And I'm still searching for a method to help them figure out sort of what isn't a significant question and how to formulate that. And I'm wondering how you help them, how you guide them in that process.
Sure. I think one of the things I notice is one of the reasons why students don't ask the question, and this was easily found from my first and two the earlier guest lectures, is that students were intimidated. They were intimidated by the guest speakers. They were, in a sense, they're like, hey, we have an expert in this field talking about the subject that they're experts in, and then you go ask the questions and ask challenging questions. And I think that itself was a tall order for the students, because a lot of things I noticed were happening in students' mind. First, they were kind of also struggling. A lot of them were struggling to follow along even with the guest speaker. And they also were, there was some image kind of aspect where they didn't want it to seem, they didn't want it to look like they're asking very naive or questions. And I think that's kind of where the early discussions really helped as students, like, what are your thoughts on these issues? And then, are those, ask the questions first and go through several rounds or go through these kind of early discussions and build confidence that, yeah, I don't know. I don't know, and our course doesn't cover it. So maybe, and there's not a lot of reference material. So maybe you should, that's the question you should ask, right? Because I think doing those actually builds confidence in the students. It's like, oh, okay, well, Dr. Ru didn't know it and our materials doesn't cover it. So maybe since you're the expert, that's the appropriate place to ask. And when you do a series of exercises such as this, it actually builds in confidence.
Right.
Does that help?
Yeah, that does. What questions do other folks have? Josh.
Shin Kue, thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation. I think it is so appropriate for the era that we're living in, and I haven't thought about some of these things for a while. In a comfortable cocoon in United States, from looking at some developing countries and things like that. So my question for you is that, when you have these outside speakers who are experts and, dealing with worldwide issues and things like that, do your students change their perspective from, perhaps, where they're from, the exposure they have had in previous experiences? Do they express their interest in going beyond, whatever they thought was the appropriate place to go with their, political science degrees from ISU?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the speakers actually serve very interesting functions. First, it starts to check or kind of invalidate a lot of the assumptions that they have. A lot of the students kind of, and a very good example is like agriculture. Like students think like, oh, my parents, were, my grandparents were farmers, my father were farmers, and I'm going to be farmer, possibly farmers. And I tell them, agriculture has changed, right? It's when you're working on a farm, it's not your grandfather's farm, right? The economy has changed, the setting has changed, and you need to be cognizant of that. And so, a lot of these kind of, unfortunately, it's trying to kind of bring awareness to these changing conditions. And I think that really kind of makes them a little more forthcoming in terms of maybe there are other things. Maybe, the world is bigger than Idaho. And the reason I say this is because a lot of students I interact with, a lot of Idaho students haven't really traveled. I mean, it's kind of an interesting interesting situation, because they're aware of it because of their smartphone and Google and all these kind of Instagram and other things, but they don't really have kind of like, what can I do with that? And I think that's kind of where I'm trying to get them out of that comfort zone and saying like, you know, you can engage, you can, and there's greater opportunities. There's other opportunities. It might, you know, and to think about those opportunities. And I think the good response or positive outcome is that students are thinking about like, how can I work on these things? How can I, you know, and one great example of, and being a political science department is encouraging students to take the State Department exam. And Pocatello is actually a center for test taking. So I tell them, it's like, there's no excuse for you guys to not take the test because Pocatello is a test site, a test center for the State Department. So thinking about those opportunities, and also, you know, being also encouraging the news. I mean, even locally today, I mean, we see news in Idaho State Journal saying that, hey, you know, they're building a hub, a freight train hub is in the works. Also, we know that even Idaho hay is being now transported to China. Now, the reason I say all of these, and the reason I kind of, another thing, just for information, I serve as the vice chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission here in Pocatello. And which is really interesting because I actually get to see the changes or the proposals and the changes that's proposed for Pocatello as well too. And Pocatello is changing and clearly changing very differently than its preceding generation. So I guess for your question in terms of, does it help students kind of expand their horizons? I would like to say yes. And I guess those are examples, but is there other aspects that you were asking me to, thinking about me to address, or?
No, I think that answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
So I have a question for you, Q, about photos. So I love the fact you showed a whole bunch of photos for us. And I find that students really grab onto photos, and that's one of the great ways to show them other parts of the world, other ways people live, just diversity issues. One of my issues with this is it's really easy to find those extreme scenes. You can find the fire, you can find the earthquake, but that day-to-day life situation is much harder to find on photos. So I'm just wondering if, first of all, you have a really good site where I can steal from you and figure out where to find good photos. And number two, do you take time with your students and talk through the photos, or is that like a backdrop, or is it more of a, you know, this is what it looks like point, or is it something that you look at that photo and talk through the differences that the students see in the photo?
Well, the photos, so just for disclosure, a lot of the photos in today's slides were actually guest lecturer slides. So they were actually the slides or visual images that was presented by the guest lecturers. I also have some pictures as well, but for me, in terms of my curriculum, I try not to use visuals as much as possible, unless it's absolutely necessary. And the reason for that is, and for me, that criteria is based on, can students anchor some of the concepts and context that we're covering? And oftentimes when they don't, then that's when I bring in the visuals and saying, you know, because, you know, because for us, we all teach to a large degree theory, right? And in scholarship. And so that is really trying to kind of, so that is, for me, that's primary goal. But somehow certain theories just don't really gets absorbed by students. And it's like, oh, this is a theory of, like, you know, theory of revolutions. I'm like, and then the students are like, I wonder what that is, right? Never seen a revolution in my life. And so this is when you kind of start to talk about, you know, these are kind of, look at the Arab Spring, and these are the contexts that we see, and these are tumultuous changes. And students may be thinking, if you never left Idaho, tumultuous change is, you know, the storming of the Capitol is probably the most tumultuous change that you've seen. And that is actually relatively benign for other countries. So, So kind of thinking about kind of those aspects. In terms of kind of daily life, I think one of the things that I teach is infrastructure and sustainable development goals. And so one of the things that I try to do is that there are things that you don't see, such as safe, clean drinking water and sanitation. These are things that, if you're confined and the Indonesia photo that I shared is probably a very good example of that. These are things that people are restricted to or confined to living in those situations. And so now, given my course is not significantly anthropological in nature, but I can see the anthropologists actually utilizing a little more of that. But I can share, for me, I think one of the benefits I have is that I actually live in these countries and actually done project work in these countries. So I can share always my experience of, rural India, where they're like only 10% of the population has safe drinking water. Yes, I was there, and we can talk about the caste system and where the untouchable were basically she could not get water because she had to be caned every time she tries to get water. She'll be caned. And how providing safe drinking water or kind of faucet water within her compound has resolved those issues. Does that answer your question? Or I can also talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and I like you're equating your own personal experience with that, because that's also painting a picture. It's just they're painting it in their head instead of seeing it on the screen. So I like that correlation, because I think that's very true. If you can bring in your own experience, they can then formulate what it is.
Well, I do a lot of that because I also served in Iraq during reconstruction and humanitarian work after the Iraq War. And a lot of people would say, oh, and why don't you just provide cash subsidies? And it's like, yeah, that doesn't work when all the banks are bombed and gone. It's like the financial system. A lot of people think, oh, well, the cash system, transfer system, yeah, that required. You'll be surprised how many people don't have access to finance in the world. So that, and also working census system does not work when you have mass displaced populations. So yes, ideals are great, but in reality, very difficult to actually execute.
Thank you.
Okay. So, yes.
So I'm a little bit of a newer educator, so I'm going to have some more housekeeping questions on this one than some of the deeper questions that have already been asked. So when you look for your guest lecturers, do you already have an association with them, or how do you reach out to them? And the second part of that question is, you talked about sending a thank you card, but are they also reimbursed? And if they are reimbursed, how do you go about that part?
So a lot of these people that I know are association, because we don't pay any honorarium. So I know we can, and in order to pay honorariums, you have to actually get a grant. And so we've been actually trying to, so I guess two examples. One is the examples I gave, yes, I have association and I can request them. And, but also there needs to be, I always feel there needs to be some political capital, right? So in terms of like, you had to, they should be willing to do it for free. So, and that's a big question mark for, in terms of also choosing the guest lecturers or kind of the lecturers. I don't focus on the lecture itself. I focus on the curriculum and to see like whether bringing in lecturers would actually enhance the curriculum. And if not, I mean, there's no point, right? That's at least from my perspective. I know there are honorariums in terms of grants. I've been writing a lot of NEH grants recently, unsuccessfully, but that would be another way to approach it. So in terms of sending postcards or cards, yes, it was out of my own pocket, but it was just minimal. So I guess a photo and a card probably ran me $10 or something at most. So that's kind of how I approached it.
I teach health policy and as well as some other things in nursing. And I've been able to bring in some guest speakers and kind of the same thing. They came in with their own desire to help in that subject area. I brought them in because of what was present in that week. And it's asynchronous. So they recorded a lecture ahead of time. And then I invited them back for a live Q&A for the students to attend. And then we recorded that. And students who couldn't attend and ask questions, they submitted the questions to me so I could ask them. So everybody could get their questions asked. But in that same regard, I sent them a thank you card. And then I chipped in my own money for a Starbucks card as a thank you. So okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there was another way you did that.
No, I think for you, you're in a better situation. I didn't even give them a Starbucks card. So I just, but
I want them to come back.
yeah, but just to clarification, not all the lecturers, I guess, in the list actually were acquaintances. For example, like the Northgate developer, basically the developer for the Northgate project here. I didn't know that person. So I was teaching a PPP course, and I felt like given the Northgate PPP was in the news in this area, I actively searched out for that person. And I sent him an email and I introduced myself and I called and followed up, and because it was relevant. I felt it was relevant in terms of kind of the transferability. It's like, okay, PPP, public-private partnerships are happening around the world. It's also happening in Pocatello. And to get a firsthand understanding of how does it transfer to this area and why is this literature relevant. And so when we brought in Buck Sweeney, who was the developer, he was a Utah-based developer, and he came in class and shared that how the PPP project in the Northgate came about. He also talked about the problems. Idaho doesn't have a PPP legislation that guides the process, so there were long delays that cost the investor and private sector significant amount of money. They also found out that the Northgate project, they can't put down money in certain areas because that's illegal, according to Idaho state law. So like, for example, like the overpass, even though the private sector was willing to put in $2 million of their own money, that none of that money could go over to the overpass, but that was sprinkled into the Pocatello infrastructure development. So these were some of the things, approaches. And Michelle, like, yes, I think if you're working for health policy, I just received the health policy grant from Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. So that might be something interesting, maybe collaboration moving forward. So
Thank you.
Yep.
If I can jump in and ask another question, if someone is not quite ready.
I think Liz had her
Okay.
hand up. Yep, first, I think, my understanding.
Yes, thank you. I did have a question. But first I wanted to say that I taught a class last semester that was heavily featuring guest lectures. It was Native American verbal arts, and we had singer-songwriters and poets and storytellers come in. And our method of thanking our guests, because it was culturally appropriate, was to send a gift, not a gift card, but an actual gift. But the students decided that they would, that their thank you card would actually use Zoom. So they recorded a thank you with all the students there, saying a special thank you to each guest. But my question, it goes back to how you prepared the students for the guest lectures. You said you had them do some advanced reading. Did you have them do any kind of maybe biography study of the guest speaker? And I'm wondering how you engage them with the readings, because I find that readings that my guest speakers might have written were a little bit beyond the accessibility level that the students would have preferred. And there was a lot of scaffolding. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that process.
Yes, so in terms of biography, definitely, I actually just summarized the biography. So in terms of kind of, most of the time I knew the biographies or requested biographies. I also kind of, in preparation, I guess, even before the guest lectures once they confirmed, I actually wrote up a biography, like I guess 2 or 3 months before, and I asked them to approve it. If is this an appropriate way to introduce you? And that was actually circulated as I kind of constantly reminded my students, this is the person that's coming and talking to us. So that was kind of what I did in terms of providing biography information. In terms of coverage of materials, yes, like you said, I think kind of the work behind the scenes is basically, I had to read through basically, the guest speakers' publications, and basically, to a large degree, yes, I agree that asking them to. I think there is a little more active engagement in terms of like because like for example like the Cambodia Sustainable Development Report like was 200 something pages, so throwing the 200 something pages to the students and asking like let's study this before we talk really didn't kind of work. So I realized is I would actually summarize a lot of that, and almost kind of like I know it sounds like almost spoon feeding the students, but I think it was really necessary to actually understand kind of the basics of that report or publication, and also talk about like, to kind of engage in student thinking, not to overwhelm them, but also to like, what's your thought on this? Could have been done differently? Or do you think, is it missing important parts? And then it's really trying to engage, and students will be, encouraging that discussion engagement, and students will share their thinking. And there's like, oh, I don't think this report or your summary doesn't really cover this part. It's like, and being aware of that report, I would say, oh yes, if their question is pertinent to a certain section of the report, or article, I would say, oh yeah, but it does discuss it. In certain areas, when they ask a relevant question, and the report doesn't ask it, or the publication doesn't cover it, then I would say, that's a really interesting question. Since they don't cover it, so maybe we can further develop this idea, and maybe you can ask that question. So I think there is no kind of, I guess, simple answer in a sense that you do have to burden a lot of that analytical preparation for the students. But I think the challenge that I always run into is like making sure it's their voice, not my voice, to a large degree, and that they're initiating it and not initiating it. And I think that's where always the difficulty comes from. And I do have to share that not everyone's fully engaged. And that's just the reality of it. But there are instances, and of all cases, I've seen many students have sparkles in their eyes and saying, this is really fascinating. Does that help answer your question, Liz?
Yes, thank you. I was just really wondering if you used any kind of group reading strategies to approach the readings beforehand, or chunking the readings, or having the students discuss the readings explicitly. So that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we did devote a little bit of time at the end of class before and after the presentation. So in terms of before, it was basically, okay, we're going to talk about this, we're going to cover this, make sure you're aware, and this is, and that's where the curriculum really comes in as well too, is that having early engagements with the guest speakers and adjusting your curriculum accordingly to make sure that the students are, you build up the students' aptitude to before the guest lecturer. And so most of my guest lecturers are reserved more towards kind of the latter half of the semester, when they actually develop a kind of a competence of the subject matter, and so they can fully more engage and they can kind of revert back to, oh, we learned this in class, but and how does that apply to your lecture, and etc. So they can kind of, there's always that backdrop. And there's always follow-up sessions, so which is always also kind of helped kind of review some questions. And there are instances where students will tell me like, I really wish I asked that question to the guest lecturer. And I think the great thing is that I ask the students like, just email the person. And I would of course ask the guest lecturers like, oh, my students are engaged. They wanted to ask these follow-up questions. They weren't able to ask during the lecture. Would you be okay with the student asking the question, and would you be able to follow up? And most of my guest lecturers actually said yes. So. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Joshua, did you have a question? I know.
Well, it was more of a comment than a question. Every time I come to one of these things, I learn a lot, and I feel like I missed out on some of these things. So I was wondering if some of these guest speakers, especially now, are Zoom or something like that, and maybe even hybrid or something. And I feel like some of STEM students, science and engineering students might have missed out on some of these very important sustainability, examples and discussions and things like that. I would love to be able to, get some information so that some of our students might just, be a fly on the wall and just listen, not disrupt, but, learn more about how different disciplines have to work together to solve some big problems in the world. That's just my comment.
Yeah, I think in terms of kind of relations with kind of chemistry, and if I had to kind of exert to kind of one of the things that we know in terms of sustainable development is that new chemical polymers are constantly being created, and there's not enough regulation for it. So I think if you ask even an EPA person now, it's like, oh, what are the new chemicals that's developed? The EPA person would not know. Because that's kind of, it's driven by the private sector and pharmaceutical industry, also manufacturing industry. They're constantly developing new chemicals. I think the latest statistics were they were developing like 3,000 new chemicals every day. Clearly oversight regulation is clearly, the administrative part is actually falling behind. Now the consequences of that into our water streams is unknown. Also, we know pharmaceutical people flush expired drugs in their toilets. That's the impact of that is unclear. Also, mapping of aquifers is still a very complicated science and imperfect. So that's also, I'm not sure. So there are a lot of kind of things just constantly where I feel it's not only kind of political science or public administration, but also, of course, it's multidisciplinary nature. And I think like some of the guest lecturers is really the interesting part is like people who are kind of at the senior levels, like for example, the UN senior advisor, her responsibility is to work with the United Nations and also private sector partners. And so the question is, how do you bring these various disciplinary experts into one area, and how do you work with them? And I think kind of getting that bird's eye view is always very interesting as well and relevant. So does that, yeah. So for your information, yes, I will. If there's any guest lecturers are talking about those issues, I'll be happy to share. Yeah, there are kind of things in the horizon. I lead a symposium for African public administration for the national conference, so there's elements of that. I also advise the government of Uruguay on their agricultural reform. So I am a part of an Inter-American Development Bank project with Seoul National University's Biotechnology Institute. And we're responsible for putting together a master plan for overhaul of Uruguay's agricultural sector to employ biotechnology advancement, which will build a biotechnology center that's range around $80 to $100 million for the country. So there are kind of things if once these kind of fund, and also for like public health in terms of Michelle, yes, we work, the most recent grant is working with United Way and the Free Clinic. And so one of the things is for us is to look at kind of upstream and downstream barriers to health access. And so we're doing these innovative pilots, or we're going to put together a comprehensive action plan for the community that will try to address those health disparity at the population level. So, and that's a 4-year grant that is received. So it's not only about learning, but it's also about implementing kind of local initiatives for the next 3 years. So, yeah, so there are kind of these interdisciplinary aspects. So hopefully, yeah. So thank you. Yes. So any further questions, Margaret? Or I know we're hitting 5 minutes left.
We're probably at that point. I'm going to sneak one last question, sort of, and maybe not just for you, but for anybody in the group as well. I'm getting ready to teach a course in spring, so I'm in the Department of English and Philosophy, and I'm going to be teaching a course on careers in English for our graduate students. And last year, when we were doing this, we invited some guest speakers who work outside of academia in leadership positions, or in a couple of cases, just professional writers, to talk to our students. And in thinking about doing that again, I realized I really like two of the people. They're executive directors of different humanities-based organizations. And I realized that suddenly this is going to put a burden on the same people who I really like and who are Idaho people, and will connect well with some of our students. And so I was thinking about the possibility of recording some of these interviews this year, maybe not having them come physically to class, but do these other sort of interviews, presentations. And I'm trying to figure out if that would, I mean, it's not the same as being able to ask questions, but I'm curious to find out if anyone in this group has ever done that sort of public speaker option, and if so, how it's worked.
So like, what do you mean, like in terms of public speaker? Are you talking about like, so I actually served as the speech coach for TEDx of ISU. So
I don't mean that. I just mean having a guest lecturer, a guest speaker who is talking about careers in a particular field.
I think more specifically, I mean, when you mentioned like teaching English, I'm kind of thinking like there is a huge LDS population that actually taught English abroad, because there are teaching English in Japan, teaching English in Korea. Like I can just kind of, I think like 2 weeks ago, our children were playing with another family, and they spent like 8 years in Taiwan teaching English. And I'm like, and I'm kind of thinking like, that's a person, that would be a perfect guest speaker for you, because teaching English in rural Taiwan setting is, no, sorry, that's just me thinking out loud. But
no, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, I can probably give you his contact, but as well too. But in terms of recording, I don't think I did any pre-recording, because I think pre-recording is a totally different exercise. Because, and I think pre-recording actually is more difficult, because you're not really interacting with the audience, whereas and you're not taking cues from the audience as well too. So I think that's also very difficult. And also because there is no interaction, I think there is an extra burden on the host to make those recordings relevant. And I think that's a challenge. I guess I do understand that, you're asking the same people over and over again. I think recording does help. Maybe you can record the first session. That's what I did. And I made it available for, like, I know we can make it available. You can YouTube record it, the Zoom sessions, and you can kind of put it on Moodle. And for me, because it loses that interactive aspect, I just kind of posted it and asked if you guys want follow up, here are some things, but I didn't make that an essential. I didn't devote an entire class time to that lecture, if that clarifies.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And it is 10 o'clock, and I know everybody has places to go.
Okay.
So, Jen, thank you so much for joining us today. This is really thoughtful. I really appreciate hearing about the ways that you incorporate these bigger global concerns into the small world of Pocatello, Idaho. And thank you to everybody who joined us today as well.
Okay, hopefully this was useful. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Q.
I'm
Thank you.
honored, so thank you.